Cuban revolutionary leader Fidel Castro celebrates his 90th birthday with family, friends, and a few choice words. Hello, I'm Anand Naidu, and this is The Heat. It's been nearly 13 months since Cuba and the United States re-established diplomatic relations after more than 50 years. But don't tell that to Fidel Castro. At the age of 90, he may look frail, but there's nothing wrong with the former Cuban president's willingness to take on an old foe. In an article published over the weekend, Castro criticized the United States for what he calls the dangers it's caused humanity, writing that mankind is faced today with the greatest danger in its history. We must preserve peace around the world and must not let any world power believe it has the right to kill millions of human beings. Later, we'll talk with a former Cuban diplomat and a Cuban journalist, but first, for more on Cuba's former president and icon, here's CCTV's Michael Voss.
As Cubans flock to the annual Summer Arts and Crafts Fair in Havana, they first pass through an entrance hall lined with photographs of former leader Fidel Castro, one of many tributes to mark his 90th birthday. Some stop to pose for pictures beside portraits of the man who ruled this island for almost half a century. His official title today is Historic Leader of the Revolution.
He's like my grandfather. Everyone loves him. He is important in this country and in the whole world.
Fidel Castro may be old and frail, and he's rarely seen in public, but politically he is aware of what's going on in the world around him, and when he doesn't approve of something, he says so. It was the historic visit of US President Barack Obama that prompted Fidel's most recent intervention, writing that it was enough to give Cubans a heart attack on hearing what he called Obama's sugar-coated words. Fidel Castro then made a rare appearance at the Communist Party Congress in April, speaking of his mortality, but confident that his politics would outlive him.
Everyone's turn must come, but the ideas of the Cuban communists will remain.
Some now suggest that in old age, Fidel Castro has become a rallying point for those who want to maintain communist orthodoxy and limit the pace of change.
Yo soy fidelista.
I'm a Fidelista, a supporter of Fidel Castro, 72-year-old Miriam Oliveira told me proudly. She agrees with Castro's skepticism over renewed relations with the United States.
Cuba tiene que tener cuidado.
Cuba must be careful. We welcome the reestablishment of relations, but we have to tread cautiously. They have always tried to use ideology against us. I'd prefer they didn't come to open businesses here.
Es un cuento camino.
In his speech to Congress, Raul Castro said, half-jokingly, that there are two political parties in Cuba, those who follow Fidel Castro and those who support Raul. But magazine editor and social commentator Rafael Hernandez believes that Fidel Castro's influence today is limited.
I think that it is very clear. They have two different roles. Raul was the co-pilot, he was the pilot. Now Raul is the pilot, and he is not the co-pilot, but he is walking around in the cabin. He didn't live 100% the airplane. Well, from time to time, he's saying something.
Fidel Castro at 90. Whatever his influence, there are no signs that he intends to go quietly. Michael Voss, CCTV, Havana.
Joining us from Havana to talk about the influence and legacy of Fidel Castro, as well as Cuba's developing relationship with the United States, is Cuban journalist Cristina Escobar. With us here in Washington is Eric Langer. He's a professor of Latin America history at Georgetown University, and also with us from Havana is Cuban diplomat and educator Carlos Alzugray. Thanks to all of you. Ambassador Alzugray, let me start with you. So Fidel Castro turns 90, and he's showing that he still has a lot of fire in him. Very harsh criticism of the United States. Why is Fidel Castro being so critical of the United States at a time when both nations are trying to restore diplomatic and other relations and put the past behind them?
Well, I think you have to take into account how much hostility he received from the United States for many years. After all, he has a record of being the object of assassination attempts for many years. Plus, he, no doubt, that has an anti-hegemonic or counter-hegemonic position in world affairs, and he looks at the United States as not completely reforming. His attitude towards the Obama administration has been critical at times, but at times he has also praised the Obama administration. I think that if you take into account his history, if you take into account how much the U.S. tried to destroy him, I think it's normal that he would have a very critical attitude towards the United States. After all, he's not in power right now. If he would be the president, one wonders if he would have the same kind of reaction, but he's now a free man. He can say whatever he thinks, and obviously he's saying it.
Cristina, when we listen to some of the rhetoric coming from Fidel Castro, it sounds like some of the words we used to hear during the Cold War, and of course the younger generation in Cuba will not have very strong memories of that war. So how do young people in Cuba see Fidel Castro now?
That's a very good question. You know, we still have a very strong policy that comes from the Cold War, which is the blockade or embargo, as you call it in the U.S., and that's still in place, even in this scenario in which Obama has asked several times to the Congress that leave that blockade. So when he talks about the future, we would love to see that future, but actually, in our present, we still have that very old policy. Fidel is a man that has an unquestionable leadership and authority in Cuba, even among young people as myself and in my generation. Of course, we do understand that he was the president and governed through a different time than the one that we're living right now. And Raul Castro is being developing in a very independent agenda and related to the moments that we're living in. But we still see Fidel as an ideological pattern to follow in some cases, and also a person that did a lot for Cuba, that developed a lot of things that we inherited today, and of course someone that is getting old and is taking his time to be with his family, and now we have a different president. That's very important to understand. He's not ruling in Cuba, he's not governing Cuba, and Raul is doing it now, and even though we see him with respect and a kind of thank him for what he's done, we do know that we need different things now, and we're looking forward to the future. But with the U.S., it's very, let's say, logic to see him saying that, because he has gone through very difficult periods in which dialogue or even a small understanding was not an option like it is now with President Barack Obama.
Eric, as the ambassador told us, Fidel Castro is no longer in power. He is a former president. But when we listen to what he says, especially about the United States, is that an indication that there is a significant element in Cuba that is resistant to change, or is it just Fidel Castro telling us we shouldn't forget about history?
Well, I think most of all it's Fidel Castro trying to preserve his legacy. And that clearly has to do with the Cold War. It has to do with, as my Cuban colleagues talked about, you know, a legacy of assassination attempts, et cetera, et cetera. And what I think actually is interesting is that Fidel maintains this kind of logic and continues to talk about it. But in fact, he's really created a whole new generation of Latin American leaders, some of whom are in fact in power right now, too. So in many ways, his legacy lives not just in Cuba, but in many other countries in Latin America as well. So in that sense, I think he's really just trying to, he can be the gadfly now. He doesn't have to be the practical politician.
Yeah, he doesn't have the responsibilities of actually being in power right now. Ambassador Alzugaray, is there, I mean, when we listen to the words coming from Fidel Castro and from his brother, Raul Castro, is there something of a disconnect between the brothers? You know, on the one hand, we've got Raul Castro, who's leading these efforts to restore, to normalize relations with the United States.
Well, I think the way you should see it is, or at least the way I see it, is that they have coincided strategically all the time. And as a matter of fact, during years, Raul Castro was completely loyal to Fidel, even though at times he made it a point to say that he didn't think exactly like his brother. So I think there is this kind of relationship between them older brother, younger brother relationship in which there is mutual respect, there is mutual acceptance of each other's role, and now Fidel is accepting Raul's role, as he made it clear at his short speech at the Congress of the Cuban Communist Party. I would like to pick up on something that Eric said. I think Fidel Castro's legacy is not related only to having led Cuba through the difficult period of the Cold War. Well, people like to call it, but this is a conflict between Cuba and the United States that he gave a solution. The solution was independence. And he really tried to make some deal with the United States, as well. It has been documented how many approaches he made to the United States, and he was usually rejected. So I think it's not the Cold War. I think his legacy is of what we might call the second Latin American and Caribbean independence, and that's why he's so much respected, not only in Cuba but in all Latin America and the Caribbean, because he has led the way in showing two things: the independence of Latin America from the United States, and secondly, the empowering of the masses of people who have been exploited onto the Cuban Revolution. I think these are two things that you have to tip the hat to him and say he got that right.
Eric, is that something that's perhaps overlooked, the fact that Fidel Castro did make approaches to the United States, did reach out to try and normalize relations, but was rebuffed, was rejected?
Well, I think in part, but in fact, I think in some cases it worked, such as under the Carter administration, where clearly Cuba and the United States talked about the Marielito boat lift, what was happening there, the permission for people to leave, etc. So my sense is I'm not a diplomat. I've never been part of the Foreign Service or something like that. But it's quite clear that under the radar there were always conversations going on at different kind of levels, despite the rhetoric. And this is something that I think perhaps now future historians can look at, once documents are declassified and things like that. But quite clearly it was never in the best interests of both Cuba and the United States to completely stop relations, though that probably did happen, let's say, in the early 1960s. But after that, I think there were always ways of communicating, and that's something that we need to look at, I think, in the future, because quite clearly there always was some kind of coordination despite the rhetoric. And obviously Cuba did what it wanted, even under the Soviet hegemony. It got involved in Africa and places like that, where clearly the United States was against that. But my sense is that there was always some communication going on.
Christina, when we talk about change, between Cuba and the United States, this evolving relationship that we see right now, it's only been very recent, 13 months ago, that we started seeing or hearing talk about this change publicly. In Cuba itself, what has changed? I mean, has any of this change filtered down to the average Cuban there?
Well, I would love to give you a better answer than the one that I'm giving you. I'm very satisfied because of the accomplishments that Obama has made around reestablishing diplomatic relations with Cuba and giving the U.S. citizens rights, like, for example, coming to Cuba and being able to see by themselves what's going on in this country and not just be led by very strong and hostile rhetoric from Cuban Americans, congresswomen and men. But the thing is that for Cubans, that reestablishing of diplomatic relations hasn't meant much, because the main policy that asphyxiates the Cuban economy, the main policy that does not allow Cuba to perform normally in the international commerce and in the international economy is still in place. Even though Obama has tried to make some changes, he's not able to do it because it takes a congressional act. So that means that for Cubans, besides seeing more Americans on our streets and besides seeing a lot of visitors from the U.S., actually in terms of how our economy and how we can work actually is pretty much the same, because we cannot use the US dollars, we cannot, banks run away from us because they're afraid of getting fined from the Treasury Department because of doing transactions for Cuba. So in general, still the main issues of the blockade or the embargo, as you call it, is still in place. So that means our life hasn't changed. And there's a tendency from the U.S. government to talk about getting closer to the private sector in Cuba, which is okay. But the private sector is quite small in Cuba, and the main services that we Cubans receive are provided by the government. So definitely governments needs to talk between each other, needs to be able to make business between each other, and for that the embargo or the blockade needs to be lifted immediately. So until then, our life is not going to change.
Okay, we have to take a break right now. More on Fidel Castro and Cuba when we return. Stay with us. You're watching The Heat. Welcome back. We're talking about Fidel Castro, who just celebrated his 90th birthday, and Cuba's developing relationship with the United States. Let's get back to our panel. Eric, I want to talk about something that Christina mentioned a moment ago, and the fact that is, you know, you get these two countries, the United States and Cuba, trying to restore relations, but at the same time, the embargo, the blockade, as it's called as well, is still in place. Are we going to see any kind of significant change for ordinary Cubans if this embargo remains in place?
Well, first of all, I think you have to distinguish between two things. One is establishment of diplomatic relations. The other one is change within Cuba, or the United States, in fact. And I think those are two different things, and I think we often mix them up. But in brief, I think in terms of change, it really hasn't happened yet, because many of the most important things that are going to happen, for example, the airlines that are going to be permitted to fly directly to Havana from Miami, that's only scheduled to start in September. Telecommunications, internet access, things like that, is only getting established right now. So, and the US government and the Cuban government are right now in negotiations to do so. But quite clearly, the embargo has had a tremendous effect, and in fact is the largest issue, and that's an act of Congress. It's not the president or the State Department saying, no, we're going to stop doing that. And so it really depends on that. And my sense is that, at least it looks like right now, with the elections coming up in presidential elections in the United States, that Congress might change quite a lot. So there might be new opportunities here to start thinking about getting rid of the embargo, which takes an act of Congress to do so. So a question whether that happens or not. For one thing, tourism, for example, you cannot just go as a tourist, as an American, to Cuba. You actually have to have a purposeful visit. In other words, you have to have some kind of reason, so you can't just go for spring break or something like that. So it's a little bit more difficult. So clearly many of the changes haven't really happened yet, and hopefully they will relatively soon.
But Congress may have political reasons for keeping that embargo in place, but a lot of this change is being driven right now by business in the United States, isn't it?
Correct. Business is very much looking forward to opening up new markets. But there, the Cuban government has been very, very careful because, again, one thing that is that maybe in the United States, we want to see certain kind of change, but the Cuban government might not. And so I think they're very careful in starting those changes because clearly the Cuban government thinks of itself as remaining in power forever. And if you want to remain in power forever, what do you need to do that? And that's really what the negotiations are about to a large extent.
Right. Ambassador, what is the feeling in Cuba? Is there optimism there that this embargo, this blockade will be lifted soon and that there'll be more business, a more of a business relationship between the two countries?
You cannot say that everybody thinks the same way. Personally, I am cautiously optimistic. I think a situation might rise that we will have the lifting of the embargo. I think that probably is going to happen in the next 4 or 5 years at the most, but maybe earlier. As Eric said, it depends very much on the results of the American election. My suspicion or my bet is that Hillary Clinton probably will be elected president, and if she's elected president, maybe the Democrats get the control of the Senate and the House. Then something might happen very quickly. if Trump wins, that's a different situation, because with Trump will win the Republican Party, and the enemies of doing anything with Cuba that is significant are in the Republican Party. So there is a big question mark there. But still, I think that the logic of what's happening is that it is in the best interest of the United States eventually to lift the embargo because of what it means for businesses in the United States. There is also, of course, what I call the Roberta Flack strategy, the killing me softly with your song strategy. Many people in the U.S. government think that they can undermine the Cuban government by approaching us with that kind of strategy. I doubt it. I don't think that's going to happen, but welcome if that's the strategy that the U.S. government is going to take. I think we are ready to face it and start developing. Remember, we are in the middle of an economic transformation in Cuba. This economic transformation in Cuba is very significant and very hard to carry out. And the U.S. government has to learn how to deal with these changes because they don't know. That's the main problem that they have when they are approaching Cuba. Their policies are based on the past, and Cuba is changing, so they have to look in a different way. Yes, it's important, the private sector, but it's important to have something to do with the state sector. Take the case of this hotel company, I forgot now the name, Starwood.
Starwood, yes.
They had to deal with a Cuban company, and a Cuban company owned by the military.
Christina, when we talk about the blockade or the embargo, how does it affect ordinary Cubans, average Cubans, on a daily basis? How has it affected them for the past several decades?
Well, in pretty much everything. Cuba is a poor country in terms of resources, so we are a poor country, and we were before the blockade. But of course, anything that we've tried to do in these years is limited by the blockade. If the government wants to buy something that has more than 25% of U.S. technology, it used to be 14% of U.S. technology. Can you imagine how many things has this amount of percentage of U.S. technology? You just can't buy it. If something has Cuban nickel, then the U.S. companies cannot buy that if it has a certain percentage. We cannot use dollars, so in every kind of transaction or operation that we want to do, we have to think about that. We have to change the currency, so we lost money in between. We have to find a bank to do that. So everything is harder, everything is more complicated. That alongside with the fact that we are, in fact, a poor country, and that we've had problems of ourselves, taking into consideration that we're inventing, we're creating a new model for the economy. Of course, all of that creates a harsh situation for Cuba. And it's important, and that's the difference. Why is it, we call it a blockade and the U.S. causes an embargo? It's not exclusively a bilateral thing between Cuba and the U.S. because it affects every kind of relation that Cuba wants to have with the world. If any country of the world wants to have a relationship with Cuba in any way, the embargo or the blockade has to deal with it. So it's extraterritorial. It's not exclusively a bilateral thing. That's why it's so strong. I even have met some Americans that have told me that knowing from the example of Cuba is where they actually get to know how powerful the U.S. is in these terms. So that's why it's still so strong. And when I think about the future of Cuba, the future that is on my generation's shoulders, I do want to see more U.S. companies and more business with the U.S., but with caution, because the kind of model that we had before 1959 was awful and was a very unequal relation, the big country taking over the small one. So we do need to be cautious because the kind of experience that we have is awful. So we have to invent this new relation in which we take advantage of this new link and also the U.S., but not just giving the country or just letting them taking over, which would be the normal, the logic thing to happen, taking into consideration that we're 90 miles away. So it's kind of hard to develop your economy, to find this new model, and also find a balance between your international relations in terms of economy. Is a big task ahead.
Right, and Cuba has made its concerns known and doesn't want to be overwhelmed by United States business in a very short space of time. Eric, another spanner in the works in the relationship, and that is we hear of these claims and counterclaims for damages. The United States says it needs to be paid damages for properties that were nationalized after the revolution in Cuba, and Cuba says we need to be paid for all the damage that's been done by the embargo. Do we know what's the status of those talks, where that's going to go?
Well, what I have read, and I'm not privy to any of the conversations, is that things are going very, very slowly, because here there are claims, counterclaims, and there's really, I think, very hard negotiations going on right now between the two parties, and my sense is that they haven't gotten very far. You know, that's probably one other issue that we have to think about. I agree with my Cuban co-participants here that the embargo or the blockade really is the biggest issue of them all. But these legal issues have to be resolved, because otherwise it's going to be very difficult legally to not have this embargo. And certainly Congress and certain Congress people, such as Marco Rubio, or even on the American side, on the Democratic side, Bob Menendez, for example, are very much against lifting of the embargo, and clearly they would have to have some palliative to see that many of these legal issues are resolved, because they actually get campaign contributions from some of the companies who would want to be compensated for what they had lost many years ago.
Ambassador El-Zugri, I want to get back to Fidel Castro's 90th birthday. He is seen as the revered leader in Cuba, as the father of the revolution. What do you believe on his 90th birthday is his greatest impact on Cuba, his legacy, if you like?
I think his legacies are basically in two fields: the field of independence and making Cuba an important actor in the international scene. Right now, Cuba is both a power broker, a peaceful and humanitarian power broker on many issues in the world. It can help Colombia reach peace. It can send doctors to fight Ebola in Africa. But at the same time, I think Cuba has created in its external relationship what one might call a norm provider country. Cuba provides norms of how to behave between countries, and this is very highly appreciated in the third world. I think both of them are internationally that's. And secondly, there is of course the empowerment and the changing of the situation in Cuba. Remember, Cuba was a country that was in the hands of an oligarchy that exploited the rest of the country. Social rights, social justice was a very low level. With Fidel Castro, all that changed. I want to say just some little thing about what Eric said. The legal issue of the nationalization process is not such a difficult thing. It is legal. It has to be dealt in a legal way. And I have been part of a government commission that has been studying this subject. And the Cuban side is very realistic about what it has to pay, but it demands that it be paid. So it is a question of the political will of the United States to do that. By the way, most of the companies got already paid because they were paid by the American government through the Claims Commission, the US Claims Commission.
Okay, and we have to leave it there. Thanks to all of you for joining us. That's it for this edition of The Heat. I'm Anand Naidu in Washington, D.C. Thanks for being with us.